Right, well, let's make a start. I think that's everybody in the room, as it were, so we'll get going. So, morning and welcome to our latest webinar. Today, exploring this topic of adult learning, as the title says there. Are you treating your learners as adults or children? So, I guess potentially quite a provocative title. So, it'd be interesting to see by the end of the webinar how accurately you can answer the question if you ask yourself honestly about it. It's been great to see there's been quite a lot of interest in this topic, as it's something that certainly we've been focused on here at Farscape over the last 18 months as part of improving our own program design, and especially with senior teams. And I guess for us the interest in the topic stems from doing an increasing amount of work with our clients, and especially their seniors, teams and execs, improving their behavioural flexibility and enabling them to make more conscious behavioural choices rather than the typical unconscious reactions to people and situations. And I guess one of the challenges that we increasingly have come across is how do you make that sort of behavioural change and learning stick? Especially when most of these people have got, say, between 20 and 30 years of ingrained habits, biases, preferences, and ways of operating in the workplace, which in their mind has worked well and served them so far. So I guess what we've been spending some time is looking at how you can really focus in on designing that learning. I'm making a word up here, that sort of stickability of the learning into a program, rather than just, as seems to be the trend, of focusing on how much new content and knowledge can we squeeze into the program. Not much of what I'm going to necessarily all that new. There are some of these sort of frameworks and structures and models that we'll talk about that have been around for a while. But one of the new areas that we're going to talk about is the area of mind, brain, and education movements, sort of pulling those three areas of neuroscience, psychology, and education together to sort of see what we can learn that will improve the quality of the learning experience. So I guess all I'm really trying to do today is to point you towards a whole raft of existing research writing and pulling it together into one place, so that it's something that you can use for your own sort of design, whether that's those of you out there that are consultants or those that you design your own in-house programs. And I think one of the reasons, sort of just before I move on, I think one thing that I think is a downside to our L&D profession and the competitive industry and marketplace we all operate in, I think some people are sometimes far too focused on finding the new big thing in L&D, and often, in my experience in our courses that I've been on recently, often lose sight of some of the tried and tested basics of how do you make sure that the learning environment is conducive to making that learning stick once the workshop or the program is finished. So a couple of quick introductions before I move on. So Ruth Moody there at the top. So Ruth founded Farscape and is our managing director. So Ruth's going to be moderating all the questions that you'll hopefully have as we go through the webinar. So you've got your chat box there on the screen. If anything that I'm covering that raises a question, a query, feel free to type something in. We're not going to have audio on the webinar today for asking questions, but Ruth's going to moderate those. And if I haven't managed to cover that in the presentation during the webinar, we'll answer some of those questions at the end and cover off anything that you feel is pertinent. And then myself, Neil Kimberley. So I'm sort of co-owner of the business, but also one of my key areas of focus is the quality of the design and the delivery across our programs. And I guess for me, the particular interest in this topic, having previously many moons ago been a teacher in a classroom, is and currently a governor at a local primary school, is that there's so much outstanding teaching and learning that goes on in the best schools by the best teachers in the UK at the moment. And yet, if you think about a lot of the facilitation that, or certainly that I encounter as we go around the industry, not so much focus put on how the learning is enabled, and seems to be far too much focus on a new model, a new theory, new content. Let's get as much knowledge into a program as you can, because that's where the value in it lies. Whereas actually, if they haven't learned enough to be able to genuinely sort of assimilate that information and put it into practice when they're back in the workplace, then actually is there any value in it at all? So let's just move on to look at what we're going to cover today then as we go through the presentation, which will be sort of half an hour, 45 minutes, and then questions at the end. And I think the hard issue for me is that, we all know that organizations are run, managed, led by people. Those people largely are adults and act as adults. They're all individuals. They're to a lesser or greater extent self-aware. Most of them know to some extent about their, how their personality, emotions, values impact on the choices they make. And they've all got their own unique histories and experiences that therefore drive their behavioral choices in the workplace. They belong to multiple systems, so it's not just the system and culture of your workplace. It's, be that their family, their national culture, religion, just to name but a few, each of which has got its own values, beliefs, and biases. And yet, in our experience, that when programs are being designed for a level within an organisation, the majority of organisations that we've come across over the last few years are tending to sort of treat and manage those people as one homogenous group. With genuinely very little time and money spent on understanding each of them as an individual, and therefore understanding their individual preferences, biases and motivations around learning and development. And I guess the same then plays out for the learning development programs they receive. Obviously, there's a constant drive for targets and results these days, and constant continual improvement. And therefore, there are often also constraints on time and budget in L&D environment that often lead to design and delivery that, by necessity, has to be aimed at the average person, the most common type of person in the business, or the majority that sit in the middle. And so, unlike some of the best schools, we're not as great at genuinely differentiating for the learners that are in front of us. The adult learners. I guess that it might mean that sometimes we simply alter the content for the different layers of seniority that whether that's from moving from a graduate to a manager to a senior manager to a director and so on. But actually, in terms of differentiating between the individuals in first, less so in my experience. And so part of what we're focusing on today is, how do we help each of these individuals learn in a way that works for them, and therefore deliver the results out at the end of a workshop or program that you need them to have? I guess one great example of where that does happen well, unfortunately largely only at senior exec level, is one-to-one coaching. One-to-one coaching where it works best is where that person has got a particular challenge that they've identified themselves that they want to resolve. The nature in which they explore that issue will be largely driven by them and the coach in front of them being there as a useful resource to explore it, in the way that best works for them, rather than being, dictated to. So that's the sort of, those, you see the bullet points there, the sort of topics we're going to cover as we go through, and hopefully, as I say, pulling together some of the existing work that is out there. And I guess I just wanted to start off really briefly, and these are meant just to be pictures, not so that you can necessarily read these models, but we tend to have this sort of cycle in L&D that we often throw the baby out of the bathwater and focus on the new bright and shiny theories that are out there. And there's some great existing models out there that will help us to design a learning environment. It's not about the content, but the environment that we create. So whether that's Maslow's hierarchy up there on the top left, looking at, are we looking after people's physical needs, creating a safe environment, looking after the sort of the social aspect of learning, so that sort of self-actualization and self-driven learning takes place, through to in the bottom, in the center, Kolb's learning cycle. Looking at that, we know from a lot of the research in neuroscience how the brain learns best when it's a very experiential activity. And so how are we making sure that the content that we need to deliver is put across in a way that's very practical and hands-on, so that the cognitive processing is more likely to happen and the learning is more likely to stick. And then finally, this some of you may or may not see this model, but this is the top right. This is Bloom's taxonomy. It comes from the world of education, but looks at the layers of understanding and learning that take place in any sort of educational setting. That's in a workshop or a program that you might be designing. And I think, largely from our experience, the more content we try and cram into a workshop or a program, the more limiting the depth to which that learning takes place. So it tends to be limited there to just, whether delegates will remember the facts, understand them at a very much an academic level. But then if you haven't built in time for them genuinely be able to apply that learning either within a program, make it experiential, so that they can then analyze what's working, what's not working, to rehearse, to evaluate, then go back into the workplace and apply it and be creative with it. So it's just really to draw your attention back to some existing models that have been around for a long time. And if any of those are new to you, or maybe we need a refresher or a brush up, there's loads of information out there in writing on the internet that you can look at to sort of refresh your memory and sort of start to build that back into the design of your program. So I'm not going to go into these in any great detail now at all, but just sort of drawing attention to the fact that let's not forget that these are there. And although there might be detractors to sort of elements of some of these models, they've all still got validity to create good adult learning environments that doesn't just focus on the content. So I think the place to start that I wanted to start today then was looking at the wider climate of learning in your organization as a whole. So not at the sort of micro level of a program or a workshop, but more the macro level of the business of the organization. And I guess sort of asking some questions for you to sort of mull over, reflect on while I'm talking and afterwards, as to how the learning climate that exists in the organization either explicitly or unconsciously sends out a perception to the people within the organization as to how learning is viewed and valued. So if we start from the top, so the L&D policy. So how does the L&D framework within the organization, where does it sit? So is it central to the company strategy? Is it integral within that strategy and very explicit? Or is it pushed more towards the periphery as an add-on, as a nice to have? And again, that will be visible to the wider organization, and will start to give them a perception of how learning and development as something that's a valued activity is seen in the business. The management philosophy then is more about how is the business run generally. So is it driven more by sort of a more mechanistic approach to with more mechanistic training programs, or does it and has it developed more organically with more of a humanistic approach where the people are really involved to the whole process? Looking at the structure of the organization, to what extent is it hierarchical with numerous layers, and often where access to quality learning and development depends on the level at which you're at within that hierarchy, and the amount of funding that's available will often depend on seniority. Or is it more of a matrix organization where learning is then more self-directed based on local needs, on teams and projects? The financial policy then, I guess, asking questions around, so what percentage of the organization's resources are actually allocated to learning and development as a start point? And then secondly, are those resources and that investment viewed as a capital investment, or is it seen as an operating cost, and is a thing that's often cut and sliced at the first sign of is learning seen as the reward in itself? And then finally, I think most importantly, and I think this is something that we come across as a business almost on a daily basis with potential clients, is to what extent do the executive buy into the notion of continuing professional development for themselves? Because I think for me it's a really great measure as to how they genuinely view learning, the value of learning and development and personal development within an organization. So, you know, and I'm not talking so much about sort of technical knowledge and experience, but them as individuals at that executive or senior level, how often are they going out looking for opportunity to develop, especially behaviorally, and the way that they, you know, to what extent did they live the culture and the values that's probably on the posters around the building? Because I think for me, certainly for the, you know, people in the organisation, if they can see that they personally value it for themselves, it's more likely that they value it for everybody else. And how, or on the flip side, how often, which is often the experience we get, where I'm sure you've had the same thing, where there's a need for a bit of cultural change within the business. You know, you look at designing a program that helps support those changing behaviours, but the executive will say, yes, it's the layer below us where you need to start. When, you know, all of us as professionals in the industry know that everyone else will be role modeling the behaviours that they see above them. So to what extent does that executive actually buy into that? And that helps to create that overall learning climate that exists in the organisation, and therefore influences the way the individual adults within the organisation approach any learning opportunity you put in front of them, because it'll be based on how they think the organisation that genuinely does or doesn't value learning as an opportunity. I think moving on from that, then there's a second thing. There's then focusing down onto the L&D function, department, team within any given organisation, and how that's viewed both from above and then from the wider organisation. So I guess where the perception would be positive and really helps lend itself to creating a genuine learning culture is where they're seen as that proactive consultant that's out there identifying and really being embedded within strategy, you know, really advocating learning as something that will proactively help the business and stimulating that culture as well. You know, is seen as a genuine proactive agent for change and is treating the whole organisation as client. Whereas the sort of, you know, the polar opposite to that might be where that team, that department, or that individual is seen, you know, more of a reactive resource that's there for remedial interventions, or simply there to manage the logistics of enabling programs that are delivered from, you know, delivered elsewhere, or administering programs, you know, or just simply providing learning experiences that people opt into, and it's therefore individuals are the clients rather than the whole organisation. So I guess it'd be something, not to go into more depth on now, but just for something to you to you know, maybe reflect on your own position and department and say, to what extent are we, you know, either helped by the wider organisation and be, you know, seen more in a more positive perception in terms of how we help or hinder that wider learning environment. So moving on then, so I just wanted to spend some time looking at, so what are we talking about when we're talking about creating an effective adult learning environment? And I guess whether we'd like to admit it or not, the majority of organisations, because of all those pressures of time and money and everything else that are there with any business these days, often because it's let's get more content into a program because that's where the value lies, it tends to lend itself then more to a more very traditional teaching approach to training, or, you know, pedagogical one. You know, pedagogy coming from the Greek word paid, meaning child, and agogos meaning leader of. So, you know, more literally translated, pedagogy is, you know, the art and science of teaching children. And I think if there are some very key assumptions in that very traditional pedagogical approach, and I think actually if you then apply those assumptions to some of the training and that you might see in your organisations or programs that you go on yourself, how much are we taking that traditional approach that probably doesn't really apply that well to adults? So I'm just going to take you through this diagram now, and in terms of if you were doing it in a very traditional pedagogical approach, and maybe you can answer those questions in your own mind as to how much of that do you see in the programs and courses that you're running or are being delivered to you. and how many of them ring true. So the first one then they need to know is, in the assumption here in a very traditional approach is that the learners only need to know what they need to learn in order to pass something or be promoted along a scale or a hierarchy. So how much of the learning that's going on in your organizations is because you're telling learners they have to do this to move on to the next thing, rather than them choosing or selecting to do it. I guess the second assumption there, key assumption in a very traditional approach, is that about the learner's self-concept. So this is one where it's the facilitator who sees the delegates as dependent on him or her because of their level of expertise and knowledge around a subject. And therefore, the learner's self-concept also then becomes one of being a dependent personality in the process of learning. So it becomes a very passive process rather than being self-directed. There's then obviously then the role of experience. And again, in a very traditional approach, the assumption there is that the learner's own experience, is of relatively low worth as a resource, and that actually it's the expensive facilitator or the author of the new book or the new theory, the curriculum designer, the person who's produced the PowerPoint, that's the person that's the most important, and it's all about them transmitting their experience and expertise to the learner. So again, very much a transmit process. There's then looking at the readiness to learn, and the assumption in a very traditional approach is that the learners only become ready to learn when the teacher tells them that it's time and necessary to pass the next stage or be promoted. So again, on courses and programs that you're running, are people being told they need to go on them, or are they being asked, or is it an environment where they can suggest what it is that they need? Because their approach to that learning will be very different. Also, their orientation to learning. So again, the assumption in a very traditional approach is that learners would see learning very much as acquiring subject matter content. So the experience then is very much designed around the logic of that subject matter, rather than being able to explore, experiment, and be innovative and creative. And then finally, motivation. So again, the assumption in a very traditional pedagogical approach would be that learners are motivated more by external, extrinsic factors. So for example, that might be feedback, a remedial need to improve something from their line manager through an appraisal process, or their desire to get the approval or react to the disapproval of a facilitator in a room, or it might be because it's about promotion along a scale. It's the only way you can do it, or other external pressure. So if I guess if we examine those assumptions, very traditional, teacher-directed approach, you can actually see there are many sort of parallels in many organisations where this is the approach that's often taken to training. And then it's probably not so surprising then why many people often don't respond well to going on new learning experiences or training, because there's a feeling of it's like going back to school. I haven't asked for it. It's not how I want to learn. It's not why I want to learn. And so what we're going to move on to now is so how might we engage in creating that learning environment in a way that it generally does engage with an individual who is an adult. So how can we treat our learners more as adults then? And I guess what we have to sort of bear in mind from the first off, which isn't necessarily different to children, but I guess because the definition of an adult is someone who does have a self-concept, who is more self-aware and can be more self-directed, is that we need to take more account of things like personality. You've got a group of people in a room. Where do they sit on the introvert-extrovert spectrum? Are they risk takers? Are they cautious? The degree to which they're able to focus and be attentive for longer or shorter periods of time. Maybe how they deal with ambiguity and uncertainty, and then how they are able to deal with the varying levels of anxiety that might come around that and learning. Or maybe even their tolerance to frustration if they're in a scenario where they don't understand it. So, and also accepting that everyone's brain is unique. and therefore so are their cognitive levels, whether that's their general mental ability or more specific controls, such as the way that they might prefer to collect and organize data. So are they visual people, or are they hands-on people, visual versus verbal? And it's not that they can only do it that way, but people will have a style that works better for them. And also then their prior experience of other learning environments, whether they've been positive or negative, and also the subject matter, in the context. So the more that we can pay attention to the differences of the individuals in both the location, the subject matter, the individuals, the more that can help us design a learning environment that's going to be more conducive to making that learning stick. So, for example, different subject matter will work with different styles of learning and facilitation. So, something that's very highly technical and new and novel would be quite difficult to learn through a self-directed approach. Similarly, trying to get people to get a depth of understanding about their personal beliefs and values might be much harder to do through a very pedagogical online process. So, we need to think about the subject matter as well, rather than, it's not just about the content and the volume of the content and the quality of the content, but how that content lends itself to different styles of delivery. And that's crucial for understanding and utilizing in the design of any program. And I think if we can pay more close attention to those, we're more likely to move to a space where we can create a learning culture that's fit for adult learners, and therefore get that learning to stick and create the changes that you need it to. So if we park those assumptions from a traditional approach, then what would that look like if you were going to take a more adult, create a more adult learning environment? What that might look like? So sticking with the same diagram, the assumptions would change. So if we take the need to know, the assumption there would be is that the learner should really know why they are undertaking the learning. What is it specifically that they need to learn and why? And also be clear on how they're going to go about the learning process and to what extent that's going to work for them. So the learning environment you create and design should provide the opportunity and space for the delegates, the learners, to ask those questions about the why, in an open and engaging way where they feel comfortable. I think similarly with the self-concept, the assumption in an adult learning environment needs to be that the learner needs to feel that they've got a high degree of autonomy in the learning process itself, and that the best outcomes arrive when the learning is largely self-directed, content specific aside. And similarly then the role of experience, the assumption needs to be that the learner's prior experience should be used as a central and valued resource in the process, whether that includes any existing mental models that they may hold, either about the subject or about the learning process, and the content and the subject matter itself, so that they can attach that to previous experience. I think the readiness to learn is acutely important here in a genuine adult learning environment. So have they been told that it's time to learn, or have they chosen that it's time for them to learn? Whether that's due to a career or life-related issue, or is there a specific developmental need that's related to a specific task ahead or project that's coming up, and so on. Similarly with the orientation to learning, it's important to understand as are they approaching learning from a more problem-centered standpoint? They've got something specific they need to sort out, or is the learning very much more contextual to their own personal situation? And again, is there flexibility within the program to accommodate that? And then finally, I think motivation, which sort of ties into some of the previous 5 points, is the motivation will significantly drive the outcomes of the learning experience. So are they extrinsic motivators, or are they intrinsic? And the more intrinsic they are, as in, is there a personal payoff for me, the more likely it is that they're going to engage in that learning, and therefore the learning will stick. And I guess so what we're trying to draw attention to here is how much can we design this into our programs. And I think that the sort of takeaway for me is the more that we can try and remove content from programs, and focus on building in the time and space to allow these conversations to happen, yes, you'll be getting through less content, but it's more likely that whatever content you do deliver will stick and will be adapted and utilized and used and challenged back within the business. So that's sort of the larger sort of creating that learning space. I think the other thing to then focus on, which is a big part of our own philosophy, and we've touched on in previous webinars, and I'm just going to briefly go over here, is about the learning environment itself. So the space that you create, whether that's a workshop or a program, whatever it is, what is that learning space? And again, if you take the most outstanding schools in the country, this is an area that they spend a lot of time focusing on, creating a physical space that lends itself well to learning. So I've got a whole load of icons there that list a load of things that will impact on the quality of the learning environment. So starting at the top and I'll come back to a few exploring a bit more detail, but air quality, the air quality, the quality of the AV and the IT, refreshments, access to and quality of, the physical size of the space that you've got, the layout of it, privacy, both visual and auditory, can you be overheard what's going on in the room, access to the outdoor space, so indoors or outdoor learning, external noise, access to natural light, the comfort of the seating that is available, the ability to control the temperature, and then the quality and range of resources that you're presenting to people. So I'm sure none of that stuff is new to anybody who's listening to this, but often I think because of those pressures of time and budget, that the two driving forces often tend to be what's on the right hand side. How much can we afford for the space and where is it geographically? And whilst we understand why those are big drivers within organizations, because everything costs and time is money, they have very little impact on the quality of the learning that comes out of the situation that people are in. Whereas all that list of very simplistic things all completely do impact on the quality of learning. So just to take a couple, for example, if we take air quality, if you've booked a learning space that has no access to natural ventilation, often any of you that sort of run programs and facilitate will know there's that moment after lunch where there's a big lull, and often we talk about it's because everyone's full after lunch. Actually, that's probably less of an impact as the quality of the airspace. But we had some engineers working with us recently who actually brought in an air quality monitor for us on one of the sessions in a similar room as I've just described. And as the levels of CO2 rise in the afternoon and the quality of the air, people being in it all morning, there isn't the ability to naturally ventilate that by opening windows or doors and letting fresh air in. It's that impacts on the cognitive ability in the afternoon of a program. So just one little example whereby by simply choosing a space where you can take control over naturally ventilating it, letting all the CO2 out and getting some fresh air in, has a significant impact on the quality of people's thinking. Similarly, just take something as simple as the comfort of the seating. If you're going to have people sat in a room for the day, how many times have you been in a hotel conference room where the seats they use are what they use for weddings and things like that, and then lots of neuroscience research will show us how physiology impacts on the quality of cognition. So if people are feeling physical discomfort as they move throughout a day, their ability to focus and be attentive on whatever the content is significantly reduced. So I think all of these things tend often to be sort of seen as on the periphery as, we'll sort of think about them if we have the time and the money. But actually, for us, certainly within Farscape and our programs, they're central to creating that right learning environment. And if you've done that well, it's then much easier to focus on the psychological learning environment in any space that you create. And I've just put up here 3 different approaches to creating that psychological space. So, a behavioristic approach to psychology would focus more on, the effective contracting of, is this an intact team and knows each other well, or is it a team of individuals that have been brought together across the organisation, so that level of trust will be lower. So how do you How do you build that into the program? Getting some understanding of what the individual intrinsic motivators for being there are, regardless of what the organisation has set the program up for. Assessing what that learning climate is, and also understanding what the rewards are in it for the learners. Whereas the cognitivist approach would be more about let's make sure there's very sense of orderliness to the process. Is it very clear agendas, timings, and structure to the process? Clean language, clarity of communication, absolute clarity on individual goals. Sharing of those, recording of those, returning to them throughout the workshop or program. And also encouraging experimentation. So, how often do we build take a school environment, build play into it around a topic or a content, to get hands-on with it and try and break it and see how it works rather than just be talked at. And also then celebrating failures, actually getting people hands-on with a new topic and allowing them to fail and saying, that's great because that's how you're going to learn with it in that safe environment is really important. And then obviously then taking that humanistic approach is more around, how do we go about understanding what feelings of safety need to be there for people depending on the topic that you're covering. How do we as the facilitator for the session create that caring atmosphere, and how do they do that for themselves? How do we accept difference of opinions, difference of backgrounds, difference of experience, using that as a central tool to the learning? And how do we quickly build that trust in each other in that learning environment, which helps to build that group loyalty? So not necessarily that you would want to take just one of those approaches, but combining all three of those proactively and genuinely thinking that's an important learning environment massively impacts on the quality of the learning that takes place around whatever content you've then designed. And so I think those two things, the physical environment and the psychological environment, are often not overlooked, but sort of sped past in preference to what content are we going to deliver and what outcomes we're going to achieve, and volume rather than reducing the volume but increasing the quality. So one of the areas I want to move on to now then is looking at the mind-brain education movement. So this is a movement that's sort of come about over the last probably about the last 5 to 10 years, and what it's really trying to do is bring together three existing sciences. So the mind would be the psychology, so the psychology of learning and individuals and personal development. The neuroscience, and how neuroscience is starting to show us how brain structures interrelate and how we can learn elements of that help design learning environments better. And also then obviously the world of education, probably largely geared more towards sort of adolescents and young adults, but what can we learn from that? And by bringing those three fields together to collaborate more closely, we can use some of that then to help design better adult learning environments. So there are, I've sort of summarized this from a recent book by a lady called Tracy Takahuma Espinosa. I have to read that out because I knew I'd forget it. And we'll share this in the reading list after the webinar. But she's pulled together some of the work that's been going on over the last 5 months. It's a fantastic resource if you want to go and have a look at it. And these are sort of the 5 main sort of well-defined and evidenced concepts that underpin this approach in this mind-brain education movement. So the first one is that human brains are as unique as faces. So the fact that you've got a room full of unique brains, you need to treat them in a way that they are unique. So don't treat them like they're all the same. Yes, they all share similar structures and patterns of development, but the uniqueness of them means that they all learn in subtly different ways to each other. So for example, let's say you've got a 25-year-old multilingual lady in the room, and you've also got a 45-year-old monolingual male in the room. The way their brains will have developed over time, just on that basis of experience of language, will mean that their brains are wired slightly differently, and so that the way they learn on certain topics would be different. So it's something that we need to bear in mind, that the people in front of us don't all learn the same way. And that's not just a gut feel as it probably always used to be. It's now proven in science. The second is that those brains aren't all equal due to, and that's due to that uniqueness comes from the context that they're in and the ability of that to influence the learning. So what we're sort of getting at there is that the context in which the learning takes place, directly influences the ability to learn. So as does the degree of their individual previous knowledge around a subject or situation or experience, their particular cognitive ability. So it's not a level playing field for the people that are in front of you if you're leading a program, and it's important to to take that in mind and take the time to understand that with the individuals that you've got. I think again something that we've probably always known but didn't necessarily have the proof is that the brain is largely changed by experience, practical experience. So to sort of put that in real sort of simple terms is, for those of you listening now, the brain that you woke up, that you go to sleep with tonight, won't be the same brain that you woke up this morning. The experiential activity that you'll go through today, influences how the brain changes and wires. So it's the idea that experiential activity and practical activity and rehearsal helps those minute changes stick and strengthen within the brain and the structure of the brain. So, some of you might have heard the phrase, which actually came about back in the 1950s, that neurons that fire together wire together. So it's this idea that practical experience and rehearsal enables that learning to stick in a better way. So the more we can build it into our programs, again, the more that learning is going to be able to stick and be used afterwards. And also that the brain is highly plastic. It develops throughout life. It becomes more limited as we go on with age, but it is still plastic and still can learn. So again, you can teach an old dog new tricks. So again, one of the bits of pushback, certainly I often hear, certainly one-to-one coaching from senior people is, well, it's too late for me. I've done it like this for the last 25 years. It's too late to change now. Well, that is nonsense. Absolutely, in the right way, in a tailored learning environment, the brain can rewire itself and has that degree of plasticity. And also the final one then is that we learn better and faster when we relate new information, content of a program, to things that we already know. So it comes back to that adult learning environment we talked about earlier. So that's why it's so vital to utilize delegates' existing knowledge and experience as much as possible, and then make conscious reference to it, to the new activity through activity rehearsal, and reflection, so that they can make those new connections and wire it together. And so just to sort of to round off on I say there's way too much detail from this new mind-brain education movement to go through today, but just to sort of give you some of the evidence of this, or some of the stuff that is now proven from these three different fields. So, and this is what all the best educators should know. So we've talked about the brain is unique, and we need to bear that in mind, and that the brain is constantly changing and is plastic through daily experience. So if we want delegates to learn new content, we have to engage in that practical experience and rehearsal so that the learning sticks. We haven't touched on emotions, and we've done this in previous webinars talking about emotional literacy, but all the research shows that some of the best learning comes through memory, getting it to stick, and the more positive the emotional memory is, the more vivid the memory will be. So creating those safe psychological environments, learning environments, is crucial to getting that learning to stick. And so it ties on to the next thing, learning is inhibited by threat. Again, we've touched on this in the past, sort of about talking about the sort of safe brain and threat brain. If people are in a learning environment where they feel anxious, where they're not feeling comfortable with the challenge and everything else, they'll go into that threat brain state, and it's very much then about survival. And so the cementing of positive emotional memories won't be there, and therefore the learning won't stick. Quality learning needs both attention and memory, and again, so that's where the physical environment comes into it. If you haven't created a physical environment that enables people to attend to the content that's in front of them, it's unlikely that it's going to be attached to those quality memories. And also that the brain makes most of its sense through social interaction. So the more that the facilitator is talking, and I'm just conscious of the irony that I've just talked for 45 minutes at you, but the more we can make learning a social interaction, the more people are going to make sense of the content and any theories you want to put in front of them. And then finally, that feedback is essential to the learning. So how much is feedback built in to any sessions you're running? So not just feedback about what they thought and felt of it after the program is finished, but feedback in the moment. How are they finding this? What, the rehearsal side of it, giving them feedback about what they're doing. Is that time built into the program? We've talked about the plastic throughout our lives, but also that the learning is both conscious and unconscious. That if we've created the right physical and psychological environment, it's not just the learning isn't only what us as a facilitator are saying. The learning is going on all the time, so long as you've created that right environment. Again, going back to the physical environment, neuroscience, there's plenty of research that showed us that learning engages the whole physiology of the body. So how what we're noticing in our body, heat, temperature, thirst, hunger, external stimulants, sounds, sights, will all impact on the quality of the learning that's going on at a cognitive level. The brain seeks novelty. So again, not just necessarily talking about novel content, but novel in the ways that it's being delivered, so long as it actually does genuinely create that learning environment. And that if you've created the right environment, that we have an innate desire with us as humans to learn. So it is there, and that learning will stick so long as we've paid attention to creating the right environment. And finally, remembering that new facts and skills are best embedded when they're in context. So this again comes down to how have people selected to be on the program, the workshop. I think of a cohort last year that we had where one of the workshops was on high performing teams, and two of the delegates didn't have a team. They were individuals, they didn't belong to a team, and they didn't own a team. So again, they didn't have that current context to embed that skill and learning. So whilst they would have understood, I'm sure, what we delivered that day, how much they would have been able to embed into their day-to-day work would have been probably more limited. So conscious of the time, so if I just try and summarize some of what we've gone through today and things to pay attention to as a way forward then, if we want to create these genuine adult learning environments within our organizations. And it's that, at a sort of more holistic, macro level, what is the existing culture of learning in the organization? And if that isn't sending out that positive perception to the rest of the organization, what can we do to change that in the first instance? Because that will already be influencing the way they approach any future learning experience. Especially, because it's our area of expertise, culture and behavioural. For that to stick, it's got to be genuinely sponsored right at the top of the organisation. So, assessing, going back to that point, a question I raised, to what degree do your exec and senior leaders buy into their own personal CPD? Because again, that's being viewed by everybody else. And then pulling together all the other things we talked about, paying more attention to the fact that you've got individuals in front of you. It's not a homogenous group. And whilst that makes it easier to deliver content by taking that approach, the chances of them all learning the same thing and then embedding it when they get back into the workplace is very different. And then finally, thinking right at that sort of micro level, when you're in a room with those individuals, what space are you creating, both at a physical level and at a psychological level? And whatever space you've created, does it tell them that they matter and that their learning matters? So, very whistle-stop tour through a huge topic, and I'm aware there's lots of information there to take in. And as I say, we'll share some reading resources with you. We've recorded the webinar, so a copy of this afterwards. And so, yeah, I'm conscious of sort of returning now to see if there are any questions that people have raised that we haven't covered within the topic as I've been talking. Ruth, anything specific that has come up?
Yeah, thanks, Neil. A few questions that have come up, actually. One of them is around I guess the time and investments that this kind of approach is going to take. Someone here has commented that it feels like it could potentially take up quite a lot of time to get this right, and also potentially cost a lot. So what do you do in a situation where, you know, budget and time is limited?
Yeah, it's a perennial problem that, you know, we face, and I know a lot of our clients face. And I guess accepting that budgets are limited, and if they can't change, and you know, the will isn't to change that. I think the only other thing that I think works is then resisting the temptation to cram content in. And that, you know, if there's more content in and more new knowledge and new skills in any given space of time that we've got these people, that delivers us value for money. And in my experience, and sort of now backed up by a lot of what I've presented today, is that yes, they might engage with that content, they might enjoy it even, and certainly understand it at an intellectual level, but the degree to which they'll then remember that and then enact it back in the workplace is much more limited if you haven't built time in. You know, let's take a day's workshop, to stop and spend time focusing on the learning environment that's there. And so I think the only option you've got there is to accept that actually the better value for money comes from not trying to cram as much content in, pick fewer topics, but genuinely create the right learning environment to do it. And I think that's much more feasible. And certainly that physical environment thing, it doesn't necessarily cost a lot of money to tick all those boxes to create the right physical environment. You just have to be a bit more creative, innovative, and put a bit more research into finding the right spaces, which I know takes time. But if that gives you a better result and outcomes at the end of a program, then it's probably worth that time investment up front. And I know that that's certainly our experience with our own programs.
In fact, actually, someone's just commented here that SMEs always tend to add content in once you've written the course, and so it's an important reminder for people to kind of push back on that, you know, not trying to cram too much content in.
Absolutely, and I think, and I, you know, obviously we're on the outside of these organisations, so we're not on the receiving end of that pushback, and I suppose that it is that challenge of, you know, as a profession, L&D, you know, if we value the work that we do, how brave are we willing to be to give that pushback and say, no, actually, this is what, if that's the result you want, then this is how we need to go about it. If we do it that way, yes, you know, people will engage with it, and they'll, you know, we can go off and do the big, you know, hurrah activity at a big conference, and, you know, hundreds of people there, and get some really expensive speakers in, and everyone will have fun and engage with it. But will they do anything differently when they get back into the workplace? Probably less so than thinking more about how it's being delivered, rather than, you know, some of these bigger wow events or hammering in more content, as the person's just said.
Yeah, I think it's a challenge, isn't it, where you're dealing with somebody who has got that very traditional view of what training should be, and, you know, convincing them to take out that content can be tricky, because they start to question, well, where's the value in having people away from their desks, having I guess their perception might be they're just going to have a nice conversation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Another question here then, if we're assuming that we're going to take the learner's needs into account, you know, based upon some of the content that you've talked about today, it feels like a tricky balance to balance the needs of the organisation versus the needs of the learner. Have you got any thoughts around that, so that the organisation feels reassured that they are still going to cover what needs to be covered from the organisational perspective?
Yeah, so I suppose it's sort of balancing up. One is getting absolute clarity on what the organisational outcomes are, and then being willing to, you know, as we've just been discussing, willing to challenge back and push back and say, okay, but if you want that number of outcomes, you've got to go. You're not going to get that list of 20 outcomes from a one-day workshop, for example. And similarly, you know, if this particular outcome here, you know, we want the behaviours of this team to change. Well, you've got to bear in mind, okay, if that's the organisation's outcome is that change, and that change is needed for a commercial reason. You've got to take into account that those people in that team are all individuals, and you can't just then deliver them a one size fits all education for the masses bit of work and assume that they're all going to take it on board to the same extent and go off and change overnight. If you're not going to spend the time to help them understand themselves as individuals and engage with each other, then again, they'll understand what you're putting in front of them at an intellectual level, but at a sort of emotional level, probably less likely to buy into it. So, you and I know, Ruth, know, don't we? It's a very difficult balance to get right, because we always want more time with people. But I know, we know that if you get that time, the change is a lasting change rather than a superficial one.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think it's about, I guess, reassuring people who might be nervous around that whole kind of learner need aspect, that it isn't going to be therefore kind of taken off track and off on a tangent because of their needs, but paying attention to those needs is crucial in order to kind of get their buy-in and engagement in the first place.
Yeah, and I suppose just as a final point then is that hopefully what some of this new, more recent research is giving us sort of objective data and fact that we can present back to senior teams and execs to say, well, if that's the result you want, this is the way to achieve it. We can do it that way, but it won't achieve the results as well. And it's then it's more of an objective choice then rather than a gut feel.
Yeah. Final question before I think we need to finish. Someone here has commented about the fact that actually this sounds like a really interesting but very skilled approach. And do you think it's realistic or achievable for organisations to take this approach, particularly if they're working with perhaps internal trainers who don't have this breadth of experience that we've discussed today?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the interesting question how to answer. I think it can be achieved by any teacher, any educator, facilitator, coach, but it takes a degree of willingness to sort of get your own approach and say, okay, am I standing at the front of this room because I like standing at the front of the room and being in the centre of attention, and it's all about my knowledge and expertise being put across to these people, and how willing are people to suspend that notion and be more reflective about, so the reason I'm here is to be a useful resource to the learners in front of me, and so it's not all about sharing my stories and this happened to me and so on, and actually taking the time, and yes, there is a skill to it, and it takes time. It takes time to read and research and go out, but also be willing to take that approach.
Okay, great. Thank you. I think that's probably all we've got time for in terms of questions. So Neil, back over to you to just finish off.
Yeah, no, thanks, Ruth, and thanks for all the questions, everyone. Some really interesting questions there. I say it's a big topic, and the good thing is that there is lots of information out there. And as I say, there's nothing necessarily new today that I've put in front of you that some of might not have seen before. So do engage with it. Go out, have a read around. And if you want to engage with us in any further question or dialogue about it, then please do get in touch. I'd love to come and have a chat to you about how you can approach creating a better learning environment in your organisations. So thanks all for listening. We'll be sending through the recording for you, so you can play back, look, stop on different bits and look into it in more detail. And hopefully we'll see you again on a future webinar. So thanks very much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye now.